Is there any combination of words cinephiles are more used to hearing than
You've never seen it.
I've never seen it. You have never seen Casablanca? Are you kidding?
I've never seen Gone with the Wind either.
Are you serious?
no matter how many films you watch, there's always more. Countless titles of all-time classics and modern gems to be gotten to eventually. When are you gonna watch Funny Games?
I get around to it.
When are you gonna watch Funny Games Remake?
I get around to it.
Now, to be clear, that is a good thing. It's exciting to think there's always more cinema to discover, but it's also easy to feel overwhelmed by the vast swathes of unseen movies out there. For the watch list to swell in size as more and more movies get added, but fewer and fewer actually get watched. To combat this Sisyphean problem, I've decided to streamline my approach. From now on, my watch list only contains 10 movies. And only after I've watched all 10 do I cycle 10 new movies into their place. And that's what this series is all about, a space to prioritize and review a smattering of my cinematic blind spots. A place to ask, who watches the watch list? Michael Cimino's gargantuan Western epic will likely always bear the weight of being the film that killed New Hollywood. That amazing run of director-driven American cinema in the late 1960s and 70s. Whether that's true or not, the film's infamous production and box office failure endure in myth, as both the catalyst for studios wresting creative control away from auteurs, and as a symbolic end of an era. There has, in recent years, however, been a serious push to reevaluate Heaven's Gate, and sure enough, there's a lot to admire here. Call the movie bloated if you must, but the sense of scale and spectacle is enchanting, with hundreds of extras, sweeping camera movements, and detailed art direction. Coming off 2 decades where westerns leaned towards gritty and dirty, it's a treat to see the genre rendered with such majesty and elegance. I also admire the film's cynical perspective. Heaven's Gate essentially a protracted evisceration of the American dream. Not only is Cimino observant to the ways the poor and disenfranchised are crushed under the weight of big business, but also to the gradual erosion of rebellious sentiment as young people transition into middle age. But for all the movie's virtues, the initial critics who hated Heaven's Gate were not entirely off base either. Much as Cimino's sympathies are clearly with the downtrodden, the oppressed immigrants don't really register as characters so much as they do symbols. A mob of faceless victims whom the film isn't really about. The bulk of the narrative actually concerns a love triangle between 2 gunmen and a bordello madam, which is not entirely interesting. I also can't really ignore the fact that the film is rather unwieldy. I'm usually an advocate for long running times, but Heaven's Gate is so meandering and unfocused that it did test my patience at points. Even with this extra time though, the characters never fully leap off the screen either, despite the film's rather stacked and eclectic ensemble cast. So I can't really call Heaven's Gate a lost masterpiece, but all the same, this is a much better movie than it was initially given credit for, worth watching for more than just being a turning point in Hollywood history. I've had Son of Kong on the watch list for years now, and I'm not really sure why. Little of what I heard about this film made it sound especially enticing. A quickie sequel pumped out the same year as the original King Kong, but made with a fraction of the original budget, without Fay Wray, and whose reputation was largely mixed to negative. Why was I so interested in watching this movie? I suppose I was mostly just curious to see what the first attempt to follow up on King Kong actually looked like. To the film's credit, it does at least attempt to continue the story by following a disgraced Carl Denham, who, having gone bankrupt from lawsuits over Kong's rampage in New York, has left filmmaking to try and make his way on the high seas. Denham eventually hears tale of treasure on Skull Island, and decides to return to try and make his fortune, which does not make a whole lot of sense. Why in the world would this guy want to go back to Skull Island when he knows of the horrors which await him? Especially when other scenes suggest he feels some guilt and regret for what happened to Kong. It kind of defeats the purpose of continuing a character's story if you're just going to ignore that character's motivations. Really though, this discrepancy in character only bothered me in hindsight. While watching Son of Kong, I was so bored by the aimless first half of the movie where nothing of interest happened that I was frankly grateful to be moving into adventure territory, even if the behavior didn't hold water. And to be sure, this movie is a lot more entertaining in its second half. Despite the slash budget, the filmmakers still do a pretty good job bringing a giant ape to life, and I'm always happy to see a big ape. But the sense of awe and wonder so integral to the original King Kong is completely lacking here. There's still some spectacle at play, and if all you're looking for is a big monster on screen, Son of Kong will scratch that itch to an extent, but it was not the secret gem I was hoping for. There is a lot to love about Zhang Yimou's Hero. On a sheer sensory level, the film is mesmerizing, a sumptuous feast of lush color, movement, and delicate choreography that is at once beautiful and action-packed. Every set piece offers its own unique flourish, whether it be the sound of rain and the interplay of strings during the duel between Nameless and Long Sky, the aggressive camera movement as Broken Sword and Flying Moon stalk the halls, the overwhelming reds in the battle between Moon and Flying Snow, or the mirrored imagery of the waterfront memorial between Nameless and Broken Sword, to name just a few of Hero's many delights. The story itself is also very well constructed, with multiple variations on the same events, each unpeeling more aspects to the plot and characters. And that Rashomon style of storytelling is perfectly complemented by Yimou and cinematographer Chris Doyle's visual style, with each vignette's color scheme easily distinguishing the different perspectives as the storyteller and their motives shift. There is a lot to love about this movie. But there's also no getting around the fact that Hero is a rather explicit piece of nationalist propaganda, which valorizes tyranny and conquest. The film's final sequence is designed entirely to justify the imperialist rule which united China. Even when acknowledging that such unification is built on mass slaughter, Hero still puts forth that such evils are virtuous if they result in a united country. The ends justify the means. To call that a dubious message is an understatement. The ideas presented here are dangerous, both as a piece of myth-making for Shen Shui Huang specifically, and as a more general allegory for submitting to tyrannical forces in the name of nationalism. I want to give Yimou some credit for at least couching this propaganda in a message of peace rather than violence, but that actually makes for more insidious propaganda. Presenting submission to tyranny and imperial violence as the peaceful choice not only upholds loyalty to the nation as the ultimate moral good, it also delegitimizes resistance. In the film's worldview, only the violence of the oppressed is morally suspect. The violence of the oppressor serves a higher purpose. If you can get over these pernicious politics, Hero offers a lot. It is a beautifully made film with stellar production value and some excellent wuxia action scenes. Given the film was also a box office smash in North America when released in the summer of 2004, I might even recommend Hero as a good gateway to watching subtitled films for the uninitiated, as it is a breathlessly entertaining spectacle. But the propagandizing does cast a shadow over Hero. Maybe bringing that up is to be a buzzkill, but I do think those elements are worth acknowledging and thinking about. The Duelists was the debut feature from one Ridley Scott, and while largely overshadowed by his next two movies, this smaller period piece did effectively set the tone for Scott's filmography to follow. I mean, I say smaller, but the film is in fact a year-spanning story of an obsessive rivalry set amidst the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars, complete with romance, intrigue, and a series of high-stakes battle scenes. So, small should be taken with some relativity. The film isn't a cast of thousands style epic, and was in fact made on a relatively low budget, but Scott injects a ton of production value through the sheer strength of his cinematography and location shooting. The key narrative device is of course the many duels, which are filmed with a mix of grueling violence and glossy, high-impact imagery. The result is a rousing, exciting film, and the way Scott uses these duels to trace the evolution of the men and their relationship to each other is key to the overall story. Granted, if the film does have a weakness, it's that the psychology of the characters rarely goes much deeper than the surface. The actors certainly bring a lot to the screen, especially Harvey Keitel, whose domineering attitude is pinned by a hint of insecurity. But all told, Ridley doesn't seem too interested with the interiority of his duelists. Overall though, this is a hard movie to dislike. It looks amazing. Howard Blake's melancholic score adds a ton of emotional resonance, and the whole amounts to a stirring rumination on obsession, which also has a collection of awesome sword fights. In other words, The Duelists is prime Ridley Scott, a good story told in dignified fashion by a master of the craft. It's peculiar that William Friedkin ended up cashing in all his post-French Connection and Exorcist clout on a remake of The Wages of Fear. That wasn't the plan, of course. Sorcerer was intended to be a smaller project for Friedkin before making his next epic, but as production spiraled, with location shooting across several countries and the budget swelled, Sorcerer became a tentpole release, and among the first of the major new Hollywood flops.
Why do we have to stand here? This is so humiliating.
The film did have a lot working against it. For one, The Wages of Fear was already an esteemed classic by 1977 that established extremely high standards for critics, but was also obscure enough that the remake didn't really benefit from name recognition with the general public. Speaking of names, the film's title was likely also a barrier. Though it makes sense in the context of the movie and is even thought-provoking thematically, I can't blame a general audience for being confused that a movie about desperate men transporting nitroglycerin via trucks across dangerous conditions in Colombia was called Sorcerer. There are also storytelling choices here that have drawbacks. Like The Exorcist, Sorcerer begins with a prologue in a unique setting from the film's main action. But instead of 10 or so minutes which establish the demon and the hero who will eventually fight him, we get over 20 minutes which establishes the individual backstories of the film's major characters. Scene construction here is rather exciting, Friedkin mixing documentary aesthetics with hard-hitting action to great effect. But it's also a disorienting way to begin the film, and the narrative payoff is ultimately slight. Seeing how each man arrived in Colombia has some interest, but it doesn't really add much to their characters, or their relationships to each other. Comparison to The Wages of Fear is especially uncharitable here. That film never showed us how the men got here, but its characters were still more fully defined, and with more complex relationships than those of Sorcerer. I also found the ending a little disappointing, drifting more into pulp genre territory than anti-colonialist critique. So, Sorcerer has some problems, but it's hard to be too down given the film's execution scene to scene is largely sublime. Friedkin was at the peak of his craft by the late 1970s, and it shows. Sorcerer awash in gorgeous imagery and a vibrant sense of place. The action beats in the prologue certainly deliver in visceral thrills, but it's the long truck ride in the film's second half where Sorcerer becomes riveting. The sense of danger is well established with the nitroglycerin's volatility and the instability of the terrain. Winding mountain roads loaded with obstructions. Tackle on the threat of bandits, inclement weather, and the psychological deterioration of the men themselves, and you've got an overwhelming powder keg of tension. The showcase of the movie is, of course, the truck suspended on a rickety bridge in pouring rain, one man inside slowly driving the truck, and another outside to guide. This whole sequence is simply astounding, as both spectacle and thriller. Towards the end of the journey, Friedkin's usual gritty aesthetic gradually gives way to more abstract imagery which borders on surreal. I should also note that the film's appeal isn't all action. The core story of third world exploitation by Western corporations is still evident and powerful, even if I think Henry Georges Clouzot did it better. But it is as a stylistic exercise that Sorcerer most impresses. I said earlier that it was peculiar Friedkin chose to bet the farm on a Wages of Fear remake, but it does make some sense, given the material provided an avenue to really experiment with action filmmaking in an entirely different milieu for the director. Friedkin's desire to push his craft is evident throughout, and the results are, even with their imperfections, captivating. I haven't even mentioned the awesome Tangerine Dream score, or the rock-solid performance from Roy Scheider. In a bizarre way, Sorcerer's lasting legacy as a New Hollywood failure is almost a point of pride. Even the New Hollywood's failures were exceptional. My path to Hell's Angels was pretty sophisticated. I saw Howard Hughes shooting the movie's dogfights in The Aviator and thought, damn, that looks pretty cool. And wouldn't you know it, Hell's Angels is pretty cool. Famously, and by that I mean also dramatized in The Aviator, Hell's Angels spent so long in production that it was originally conceived as a silent movie, but had to be retroactively fitted for sound once the talkies hit, which meant both adding sound to filmed material and reshooting dialogue scenes outright. That jank between filmmaking modes ended up being a real boon, as it means we've got a sound movie full of silent techniques like color tinting. Even title cards get used instead of subtitles in the German language scene. I'm tempted to say the film gets the best of both worlds, the pleasure of sound, but also the assured beauty of the silent era in its zenith. The mix in techniques also gives the film a historical curiosity, as if Hell's Angels is a glimpse of what the sound film could have looked like had it developed more in line with the styles of silent movies rather than developing its own grammar. So all that's pretty interesting, how's the actual story? Well, it's certainly not perfect. Our two male leads, a pair of mismatched brothers, are all kinds of basic. One is kind and responsible, the other is an irresponsible womanizer, and we don't get much more characterization than that. The eagerness of the film to condemn Jean Harlow's character as a scheming harlot is also pretty eye-rolling, though Harlow's performance is quite a bit of fun. On the plus side, while the film is generally more of an action thriller than a serious war picture, it is more attentive to the horrors of combat and its psychological toll than I was expecting. Also, those dogfights that first attracted me to this movie are indeed all kinds of sweet. Even beyond marveling at the spectacle for the time, the sheer choreography as our heroes are dwarfed by enemy planes and the pronounced sense of danger are exhilarating to watch. After establishing himself as a screenwriter with movies like Taxi Driver and Obsession, Paul Schrader would make his directorial debut with Blue Collar, a film that is actually pretty far removed from the hallmarks I've come to associate with the filmmaker. It isn't a lonely man story, In fact, a sense of kinship and camaraderie is one of Blue Collar's defining elements, at least for a while. And the film's visual style isn't as mannered or expressionistic as Schrader would later develop. Instead, Blue Collar is best understood as a working-class riff on the 70s paranoia thriller, a story of ordinary men facing down a vast conspiracy of enemies in the shadows, pulling the strings to control the world and silencing any threats, with violence if necessary. The catch is, the villain isn't a government or a secret cabal of assassins, but an auto workers union. That shift is notable, not just in terms of the aesthetic difference it produces, but also in its thematic implications. With the repeated imagery of the Ford Motors logo looming in the Detroit skyline, Blue Collar rather cuttingly emphasizes that it is control of capital and labor, not politics, that denotes true power under capitalism. The core of the film is indeed a working-class anger. Early scenes are attuned to the daily lives of its protagonists, a trio of 30-somethings on the assembly line, who for all their differences, are in the same boat, squeezed by the costs of living, their stagnant wages, and a union which fails to protect them. There is a humor and warmth to the men's scenes together, in no small part thanks to the great performances from Harvey Keitel, Yaphet Kotto, and especially Richard Pryor, but also a persistent weight that becomes more and more unbearable. Eventually, the men decide to rob their own union, finding little in cash, but inadvertently discovering deep-rooted conspiracy and corruption. It is here where Schrader begins to shift from an observational slice of life to a full-blown thriller, one with remarkable set pieces and pronounced suspense. Despite the genre elements, working-class politics remains central, culminating in a crushingly cynical ending, which I dare not spoil. What I will say is the true boldness of the ending is not merely the darkness of it, but also its clarity in outlining how precisely the working class are abused and exploited. Depressing? No doubt, but that clarity also helps light a possible way forward. For years now, In the Mouth of Madness has been the biggest John Carpenter film I hadn't seen, often touted as the last great film from the horror legend. I can't say for sure if it was indeed his last great movie, but if it is, it's certainly a high note. In the Mouth of Madness is pretty great. It might in fact be my third favorite Carpenter movie, behind only The Thing and Halloween. The film concerns an insurance agent played by Sam Neill, who's sent to investigate the disappearance of horror author Sutter Kane, discovering an occult-like horror and an ancient evil Kane's latest novel is destined to unleash. The film fits nicely among the meta-horror movies Wes Craven was making around this time, and while New Nightmare and especially Scream might be sharper in their genre deconstruction, In the Mouth of Madness is much scarier. Carpenter doesn't really wink at the audience so much as he creates a folklore of how fiction acts as a conduit for real horror. There's a sense of primal evil, which is all the more powerful because it's unknowable. What it wants, why it has chosen Kane as a vessel, what the capabilities of its power are, all of these questions go unanswered. Given the premise of uncovering a supernatural threat and Carpenter's very deliberate pacing, I expected In the Mouth of Madness to be a slow ratcheting of tension, but that isn't really the case. 10 minutes in, and Sam Neill has been attacked by an axe-wielding maniac, and things only escalate from there. The journey into Hobbs Bay is a particularly potent piece of horror that so perfectly captures the spooky feel of a late-night drive and the strange oddities seen on the way. We also get Lovecraftian monstrosities and body horror before the film builds to an amazing ending. The only thing I don't like about this movie is the faux heavy metal riff part of the score. It is indescribably lame and sucks out a lot of the horror. Working on the No Superhero Movies Are Not Like Westerns video was something of a reminder that I have a lot of fondness for cowboy movies, and I've been trying to catch up on the genre's classics. The original 3:10 to Yuma has endured as one of the great old Hollywood westerns, and I'd say that reputation is earned. Based on an Elmore Leonard short story, the film is a gripping morality play about a down-on-his-luck rancher who somewhat impulsively agrees to escort a gang leader to a train station where he can be brought to justice. What begins in part as an exploration of masculinity gradually transforms into a more loaded story of honor and heroism in the face of overwhelming odds, anchored by two fantastic performances. Van Heflin really sells the growing pressure placed on his ill-equipped hero, but it's Glenn Ford as the villainous outlaw who steals the movie. The man projects an eerie charisma that really gets under the skin. Watching these two just talk is completely absorbing. It's certainly clear that the film was adapted from a short story, as it does feel padded, even at just 90 minutes, but by the third act, it really builds into something special. Perhaps it was inevitable that the premiere 70s auteur's first foray into the 1980s would be a gigantic flop. The mentality of 80s American cinema is essentially the antithesis of the New Hollywood, and no other New Hollywood director achieved quite as much in that time as Francis Ford Coppola. His 4-film run from 1972 to 1979 is about the most unimpeachable run any filmmaker has ever had. But all that success came crumbling down with One from the Heart, a highly ambitious romantic musical funded by Coppola's own Zoetrope Studios. Costs swelled, due in large part to the film's elaborate sets, culminating at $26 million, and the movie went on to gross a whopping $636,000. I suspect the central reason One from the Heart doesn't have the infamy of a Heaven's Gate is that Coppola blew his own money rather than a major studio's. But its failure was as much of a death knell for the New Hollywood as Michael Cimino's gargantuan western. That One from the Heart was such a failure is a real tragedy, and not just for the detrimental effects it had on Coppola's career. This is a very creative movie, frequently dazzling in its imagery and with a wonderful collection of Tom Waits music. The film somewhat resembles an old Hollywood musical, what with the action playing out on lavishly decorated sets, the large-scale dance numbers, and images which revel in their own artifice. But One from the Heart also breaks from the form in notable ways. The music scores the action, rather than the characters breaking into song. And the central romance deals with much more volatile and less charming personalities than you'd get in a traditional Hollywood musical. But I think the real kicker is the film's visual style. The casual way Coppola will transition between scenes as physical barriers break away, or the way images merge in these beautiful collages, goes beyond mere old Hollywood artifice and transcend into a more ethereal dream space. Where Coppola had started with Apocalypse Now to drift away from a realist style and into psychological presentation, One from the Heart dives right in. Stylistically, One from the Heart is frequently wonderful. Narratively, it's much more fraught. I'm not inherently opposed to centering a film like this around a less romantic couple, but the film never successfully convinces as to why Hank and Franny like each other in the first place. Both seem better off separately, and consequently, the film's attempts at romantic yearning fall flat. This is neither a story where we root for our lovers to reunite, nor is it a tragedy because we know that, for whatever love exists, the relationship is too inherently toxic. It's just kind of an inert romance, and the characters are more generally swallowed by the production, where the film's real inspiration lies. That shortcoming does hold the film back emotionally, but as a stylistic exercise, there's so much to admire here. If Martin Scorsese's New York, New York was a throwback to the classic Hollywood musical, One from the Heart feels an effort to expand the form to a new level. And it's hard not to respect that. This was a pretty strong collection of films. Apart from Son of Kong, all of these movies proved entertaining and thoughtful. Even when they went wrong, they often did so in fascinating and ambitious ways, and that makes choosing a favorite of the bunch tricky. The sheer highs of Sorcerer are so high that it almost won out, but I'm ultimately going to go with 3:10 to Yuma as the best film in this collection. That was the movie I had the least to say about, but only because it was also the least objectionable. A rock-solid piece of Hollywood storytelling that thoughtfully examined what it means to live as an honorable man, centered on 2 excellent performances and a patient yet still thrilling scenario. It's the kind of no-frills movie making that can be easy to take for granted, but is also so satisfying when done well. So with the watch list complete, it's time to select a new 10 movies for the next episode. The first half of the list is locked in and currently on screen. The second half, however, will be voted on by my patrons. If you want the power to influence my movie watching, head over to patreon.com/eyebrowcinema for access to the poll. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.